Good morning. Violence and brutality and God's apparent permission to participate in violence and brutality, as we find it in some places in the Old Testament, turns out that's a huge, complex topic that I chose. To do this properly, I should have designed a course on it, taught the course, learned from my mistakes, taught the course a second time, and then prepared this sermon. That didn't happen, and here we are. So I offer this up in fear and trembling. And if there's anything that is helpful, great. And if there are things that you feel are just plain unhelpful or wrong, as you think about why, maybe that also does some good. So, since September, we've been in an off and on sermon series on difficult passages in the Bible. Those wild, undomesticated passages, the monsters under the bed, I'm calling them, brutal and disturbing. The passages that don't end up on inspirational Christian t-shirts and mugs and greeting cards. This morning's monster under the bed is perhaps the worst of them all. It's not just under the bed, it's in the closet too. It's down at the end of that dark hallway. It's everywhere. It's waiting for you. It's what appears to be the God-sanctioned genocide of the Canaanite people. When the Israelites returned to the Promised Land after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, which was after 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Interlude. My in-laws visited for a couple of days this week from out of town. I mentioned to my father-in-law that I had a sermon coming up. He said, "Oh, what's your topic?" I said, "The Canaanite genocide." Pause. He said, "What are you going to say?" So I started listing some of the main ideas that you'll hear in a little bit. And with every point that I was trying to describe, it was late at night, I could see his countenance just dropping. I could see his eyes clouding over. It was obvious he did not think this was a wise choice. And then the next morning, out of nowhere, he said, "And remember, you'll have to have something to tell them about practical application. How are they supposed to apply this to their lives?" So that makes clear the kind of futility that lies before us this morning. I'm going to start by reading you some excerpts from the beginning of the Israelite conquest of the Promised Land as they destroy the city of Jericho. I had a whole lot more in this, but it was way too long, so I had to take it out. Much of this that I'm about to read to you will not be pleasant. And even though I'm doing what, on a resume is one of the nicest things you can do, I'm reading from the Bible in church, I feel like I should give a warning about the content. It's violent and awful, and here we go. Moses had died. Joshua had taken over the leadership of the Israelites, and it was time to enter the Promised Land after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So they entered by crossing the Jordan River. And amazingly, just as had happened at the Red Sea 40 years earlier, they crossed on dry land. The all-powerful Yahweh was still with them. Eventually, they headed toward their first test, the city of Jericho. Joshua, the new leader, had received those famous instructions you heard about if you grew up in Sunday school, marching around the city in silence for 6 consecutive days, followed by the big 7th day, during which they were to march around the city 7 times and then blow their trumpets. Then came the big moment, and I'm reading now. Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord by being destroyed. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent." And that is another story. When the trumpets sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall of the city collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. They brought out Rahab's entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel, and then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and the iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. At that time, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath. He said, "Cursed before the Lord is anyone who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son will he lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest will he set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. So that's the most famous of the battles as they settled into the promised land, but there are lots like that, lots that end with utter destruction and extermination, fires, piles of rocks over bodies. You get the idea. In the Bible, the people of God committed what we now call war crimes, and they believed that God sanctioned them. This is the monster under the bed and in the closet and down the hall. And so now, wisely or unwisely, let's try to face it. So who were the Canaanites? They were the people living, well, this is a kind of one of those answers that students make up on tests. They were the people who lived in Canaan. But actually, that's right. That's what they were. They lived in the land that God promised to Abraham, the promised land, the land that the Israelites came back to after being in Egypt, after wandering in the wilderness. They were actually several different people groups, all called Canaanites, since they lived in that region. And it's the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. So basically, after 400 years away, the Israelites returned and said, "No, this is our land. God promised." And then they attacked cities and took farmland. That's how the story goes. But there are some serious difficulties with that story, besides the obvious ethical difficulties. And we're going to talk about 2 of them. The first serious difficulty is, and there's not, like, I wouldn't be able to say this in every church. The first serious difficulty is that archaeology does not seem to support the story of the Canaanite conquest as it is told in the Bible. Yes, there is archaeological evidence of all sorts of skirmishes in this part of the world during this general time in history, but that's always true for humans in any time and place. But take the iconic battle for the city of Jericho. Archaeologists have studied the site of the city of Jericho extensively, finding layer after layer of human settlement throughout history. They're up to about 20 layers so far. It's one of the world's oldest cities, having been occupied in one way or another since the end of the Ice Age. That's about 11,000 years. About 100 years ago, archaeologists thought they had found something that confirmed the story that we read just now. Because one of the layers of the city does show signs of mighty walls that were indeed destroyed. But now it seems most likely that this was during an attack by the Egyptians, not an attack by the Israelites. The story of the Israelite attack under Joshua's leadership is set in the Bible during a certain time period. And as it turns out, some archaeologists think it may be that it was, in fact, this time period, a very low time in the history of the city of Jericho. Jericho might have been barely occupied during the time of Joshua. Now, it is always true that archaeologists have different views, that there have been all sorts of interpretations of the archaeological record, that there will continue to be discoveries and new interpretations. But the current academic consensus, anyway, is that the Israelites' story of the conquest of the Promised Land is not historically accurate, but is primarily concerned with something else. And that something else is theology. And I'd just like you to hold on to that for a second. The idea is this literature may be about theology and not about what we call history. That's the first difficulty. Here's the second serious difficulty with the story of the Israelite conquest. The Bible itself, the first problem was that archaeology doesn't seem to support it. The second problem is this: the Bible itself does not seem to support the story of the Canaanite conquest as told in the Bible. And here's what I mean by that. Often, as we saw in the story of Jericho, often we are told that the Israelites destroyed all the Canaanites. And very often we read promises that God will drive all the Canaanites from the land. So the promise is God's going to drive them out. In battle, the Israelites will have to do their part, but with God's help, the land will be free of Canaanites. And at first, when we read in the book of Joshua, that's how it goes. Here's an excerpt. So Joshua subdued the whole region. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. All these kings and their lands Joshua conquered in one campaign because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. That passage I just read you is only about the southern Canaanite kings, and in the very next chapter we're told the same thing about the northern Canaanite kings. Joshua destroys them totally without mercy, as the Lord commanded. It seems pretty clear. All the Canaanites are destroyed. But that's not true. Because after listing all the defeated kings for an entire chapter, we then learn, as God and Joshua are talking, that there are still a lot of Canaanite regions yet to be taken over, but don't worry, God says, I'll drive them out. In the meantime, God says, you can already start dividing up the land among the tribes. So that seems to be that. Except it isn't. Because as we keep reading throughout the Old Testament, the Canaanites are still basically everywhere. They were never exterminated. They are still found throughout the land. And in fact, interestingly, only 9 years ago, there was a genetic study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. I'm sure it's on all our bedside tables. It found strong evidence that the people of current-day Lebanon are closely linked genetically to the ancient Canaanites. So they're still around. But they were also still around back in Old Testament times, pretty much everywhere throughout the Promised Land, throughout the Old Testament. For a while, we read that the Israelites think this was so God could keep testing generation after generation of Israelites who still needed military experience. Canaanites as military training. But then as the Old Testament progresses, it becomes more clear that the Canaanites were a challenge, but a different kind of challenge altogether. The Canaanites were a theological challenge. And to see that, we're going to have to take a step back and remember that as the story goes, the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, surrounded entirely in Egypt by a religious culture in which there were many gods who didn't really care about people, and surrounded by a culture in which there were many fertility rituals so that the gods, who don't care, would bless the land and grant an abundant harvest. Many of those fertility rituals, as you may know, were quite sexual in nature. They were also based on the fear that the gods just don't care and have to be persuaded to pay attention, to grant fertility to people and flocks and land. That's what they were surrounded by for 400 years. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites now find themselves in the land of Canaan. And what do you know? The Canaanites also have a religious outlook that involves many gods, including many fertility gods. The Canaanites also have a lot of fertility rituals for the same fearful reason. The fear that the gods don't really care about people and have to be persuaded to help. Now, when you are living in an agrarian society, you are desperately reliant on fertility. So those fertility practices would have been highly seductive, if I may use the term seductive, to describe religious practices that involve temples and high places with temple prostitutes and so forth. So even after centuries of coexisting in the same land with the Canaanites, the Israelites still had to work to resist the worldview and the practices of those Canaanites. Yahweh, the Israelites were learning, is the one true God of love. Yahweh already cares. Yahweh already sees. There's no trickery required. There's no temple prostitution required. The Israelites, in other words, were called to live in different and much healthier relationships. Relationships with God, with the land, and with each other. So how do you help the Israelites avoid the seductive practices of the Canaanites that surround them? I've said before that when we were all children, we all heard the grown-ups in our lives say positive things about our family culture, things like, this is what we do, this is who we are. But at times we've also heard negative statements. We don't do that in this family. That is not who we are. And we find both those kinds of statements in the Old Testament too, when it comes to guiding the Israelites. The Bible is filled with both positive and negative statements. And for our purposes this morning, the awful stories and the awful statements about Canaanites, I think maybe in that second category. We don't do that. That is not who we are. And it turns out that the strong anti-Canaanite message, we don't do that, that's not who we are, this anti-Canaanite theme is hidden in plain sight almost from the very beginning of the Old Testament, in passages that are set well before even the time of Abraham. And it is not subtle once you start looking for it. Here are some examples. Just after the flood, Noah comes out of the ark and plants a vineyard, and it grows, and he harvests the grapes, and he makes some wine, and he drinks far too much of it. He passes out drunk and naked in his tent with the door left open. He was ahead of his time. We now call this Super Bowl weekend. His son Ham sees him like that and tells the other two sons, and Ham's two brothers solve the problem by walking into the tent backwards, not looking, and putting a garment over Noah's nakedness. And then Noah speaks. It's the only time Noah speaks in the entire Bible. I don't know why I said entire Bible. We wouldn't expect Noah to speak in the New Testament, would we? Noah just shows up. Hey, how's everybody doing? Still dry, I see. Good, good, good. Sorry. It's the only time Noah speaks. And here's what we read. When Noah awoke from his wine, that's a good phrase, eh? When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son Ham had done to him, Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will Canaan be to his brothers." And just to be clear, Noah is not cursing the son who walked in on him. He's cursing the son of the son who walked in on him. Noah awakes from his wine and curses his grandson. Noah continues, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." So that's a weird passage. Just a little commentary for you. In case you didn't notice, that's weird. And just after that, we're told which people groups descended from which of Noah's three sons. We're told that the Canaanites are related to the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Philistines. All the major enemies of the Israelites are associated with the Canaanites. We're also told that the Canaanites lived in Sodom and Gomorrah. So, Canaanites, bad, is essentially the propaganda here. We skip forward to the story of Abraham. When Abraham is very old, he says to his trusted servant, "I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son Isaac from the daughters of these Canaanites, but you will go to my country, to my own relatives, and get a wife for my son Isaac there." So the servant does get Isaac a non-Canaanite woman to marry, and they have twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Esau, as you probably know, wasn't so bright. So Jacob was able to trick him out of both his blessing and his birthright. But also, and this part doesn't get mentioned as much, Esau, who wasn't so bright, married two Canaanite women. They were called Hittites in this passage, but Hittites were Canaanites. This marriage to Canaanite women really upset Esau's parents, Isaac and Rebekah. So Rebekah said to her husband Isaac, "I am disgusted with living because of these Hittite women. If Jacob also takes a wife from among the women of this land, from Hittite women like these, my life won't be worth living." So Isaac calls for his son Jacob and blesses him and then commands him, "Don't marry a Canaanite woman," and instructed Jacob to travel and pick out one of his cousins instead. Far better to marry your first cousin than to marry a Canaanite. There's a bumper sticker for you. The point is that this anti-Canaanite theme goes way back in the biblical story, far earlier than the Exodus, far earlier than the Battle of Jericho and all the battles that came after. It's a huge, long theme in the Bible. We heard last week that the question for ancient Israelite storytelling isn't, did this really happen exactly like this? That's a modern historical question, but they weren't writing modern history. The question instead is, what is the point of this story? What lesson was it intended to teach? So we can ask, why? Why demonize the Canaanites like this throughout the Old Testament and often with violent stories? So I've hinted at one possible answer already. You know a topic this complex is going to have a lot more than one possible answer, but we do not have time. So here's one possible answer. The Canaanites represented a certain worldview and a certain understanding of the gods, plural. When the Israelites traveled through the wilderness and finally resettled in the Promised Land, they were at that moment extremely vulnerable to being influenced by Canaanite culture. Israel wasn't much of a nation yet. They had been immersed in Egyptian culture for centuries. They didn't really have much cultural momentum themselves, not yet. So their healthy covenant thinking about God, about the world, about what it means to be human, that was fragile and vulnerable at this moment in their story. They were learning. There was a covenant. Moses had taught them a lot. But as a people group, they were young and they were easily influenced. When our youngest, Luthien, was about 3 years old, our oldest became very concerned about this baby of the family experiencing too much screen time. Now, if you knew what our household was like, you'd have a bit of a laugh about that worry. Any screen was locked in a series of about 3 safes. But still, here's what the oldest did. Without informing us, the oldest told Luthien that every time she looked at a screen, her brain would melt a little bit. And if she wasn't careful, she would lose her mind altogether. A 3-year-old taking this in. Now, ironically, there is a kind of strange symbolic truth to this statement about screens, but it wasn't factually accurate. It was, however, highly effective, and it was carried out with the best of intentions. But again, Heidi and I didn't know, so for a couple of years we could not figure out why Luthien was behaving so oddly when we wanted to have a family slideshow. Remember family slideshows with projectors and little square things? Luthien was freaking out. She wasn't looking, she was protecting her brain. Now, I'm telling you this because it is likely that something very similar is going on in the difficult passages we're talking about this morning. The Israelites were like children. They were highly susceptible to unhealthy thinking and unhealthy behavior. As a result, so much of the Israelite storytelling around the creation of the world and the formation of the Israelite people is also infused with, basically, Canaanites, bad. Canaanites, yuck. Your brain will melt. And the stories about the total wipeouts of the Canaanites also functioned as theological rhetoric, persuasion. These stories told over and over again, the Canaanite gods are powerless. Just like Yahweh triumphed over the Egyptian gods in the over-the-top stories of the plagues, so also Yahweh triumphs over the Canaanite gods with over-the-top, clearly exaggerated stories of conquest and settlement. And then a voice from the heavens said, "And remember, you'll have to tell them something in terms of practical application. How are they supposed to apply this to their lives?" And I'm afraid that the best I can do is to tell you that the story of the Canaanites does not end in the passages filled with war crimes. In later, more mature Israelite passages, we find commands by God saying things like, "Treat the foreigners in your midst as if they were one of your own native born." I believe that when we see that change in attitude, what we are seeing is the spiritual growth of the Israelite people, who were never perfect, but always honest in writing their own records. At the beginning, they really thought God wanted them to kill and burn and steal, because that's what all the tribal gods wanted in that time and place. But later they came to realize that Yahweh was different. This is no tribal God. So the Israelites were also called to be different. And we see that understanding starting to grow. And then, of course, in the New Testament, there's a quantum leap forward. As Jesus says, love the Lord your God with everything you are, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus not only says those are the two most important commandments, but get this, Jesus, looking back on all the scriptures, says that everything in the law and the prophets hangs on those two commandments. Commandments to love. And speaking of Jesus, there is only one reference to a Canaanite, just one, in all of the New Testament. It's in Matthew, in what can feel like yet another uncomfortable passage. Let's just pile another one in. Here it is. Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and she is suffering terribly." But Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away. She keeps crying out after us." And Jesus answered, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of Israel," which is uncomfortable to hear. The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. And Jesus replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." And I want you to notice how this conversation is going just as you might expect it to go, given how reviled Canaanites had been in the Old Testament scriptures and in Israelite culture for centuries. It's really uncomfortable for us to hear Jesus talk like this. But it does fit the culture of that time perfectly. The Canaanites are like dogs. But while it's uncomfortable, it's also not how this episode ends. So to repeat, Jesus replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." And the Canaanite woman replied, "Yes, it is. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And then Jesus said to her, "You have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. That reminds me of something else my father-in-law said to me this week. He said that story with the Canaanite woman is one of the very few times he can think of that Jesus verbally spars with someone and kind of loses. Now, in the past, I have focused on this episode as being in the midst of a lot of episodes in Matthew where the disciples are being told over and over by Jesus that they have little faith. And it's also in the midst of a whole lot of passages where the disciples just don't understand what Jesus is saying. And here comes this Gentile woman who does both. She understands what Jesus is saying, and she has great faith. So there's a really purposeful contrast with the disciples, the bumbling Jewish men versus the Gentile woman. But I have not paid enough attention in the past to the fact that Matthew deliberately describes her as a Canaanite woman. Now, Matthew is obsessed with the Old Testament like no other gospel writer. Over and over, Matthew quotes the scriptures almost as many times as the other three put together. and explains how Jesus fulfills those scriptures. This man knew his Old Testament, which means he also knew exactly how the word Canaanite would land. Matthew knew how often the Old Testament said things like, Canaanites, bad. Canaanites, yuck. But Matthew makes sure we hear something different. The kingdom of heaven is for such as these. It's for all of us, even for Canaanites. So, did awful things happen in the settlement of the promised land? Yes, almost certainly. Did they happen exactly as described in the most disturbing parts of the Canaanite story? Almost certainly not. These stories were probably rhetorical, theological warnings. They were national mythology, like many nations tell themselves about their founding. This is not only common now, but it was extremely common in the ancient world. But the stories are still awful. Let's be honest about that. But the awfulness of this morning's monster under the bed does not come to us in a vacuum by itself. We need to consider it in the greater context of the ancient world, which had its own rules and its own priorities. We don't have to like the ancient world's culture. That's not what we're called to do. But we do need to be sensitive to it while reading the ancient world's literature, or else we're not truly entering into the literature. We should also consider the awfulness of this morning's monster in the context of the greater biblical narrative in which the Canaanite story ends not with a genocide, not with a land grab, not with a sneer of disgust, but with Jesus saying to the Canaanite woman, "You have great faith," and then welcoming her into the kingdom of heaven. Again, I offer you these observations and thoughts with fear and trembling. Please receive them in that spirit. Inspired by the growth in God's people that we can see in the Bible, let's end this week like we did last week with the words of John the Baptist. Think and live differently, for the kingdom of heaven is near. Amen.